Welcome to the quietest corner of the village. We knew you'd find us eventually.
Chapter 1, The Curse of the Victoria Sponge. It was a truth universally acknowledged in the picturesque Cotswold village of Carsely that if Agatha Raisin was wearing her London facer, terrifying combination of professionally applied expensive foundation, a steely gaze, and a rigid smile that didn't reach her Isomione, was about to have a very bad day. Today, that someone was technically a cake. Agatha stood in the bustling Carsely Village Hall, adjusting her silk scarf with a trembling hand that she hoped looked like elegant anticipation rather than sheer, unadulterated panic. The occasion was the annual Carsely Charity Bake-Off, an event she had entered not out of a love for flour and yeast, but out of a desperate, clawing need to be seen as part of the village. She had spent £50 on her artisan Victoria sponge from a trendy bakery in London, driven it down with the air conditioning on full blast, and then spent 2 hours in her own kitchen, dusting it with just enough imperfectly sprinkled icing sugar to make it look homely. "It looks a bit too perfect, doesn't it, Agatha?" cooed Mrs. Margaret Bloomsbury, Agatha's self-appointed rival and current nemesis. Margaret was wearing a floral apron over a beige dress that made her look like part of the wallpaper, but her eyes were sharp as needles. "Quality always looks perfect, Margaret," Agatha snapped, her voice carrying a sharper edge than she'd intended. "Unlike some things that just look thrown together." She pointed a manicured nail toward Margaret's slightly lopsided lemon drizzle. Margaret flushed a deep, satisfying shade of puce. "Well, at least mine is authentic. We all remember the quiche affair, don't we, dear?" Agatha felt the ground tilt. A quiche affair instant where she had entered a shop-bought quiche in a competition, only for the baker to turn up dead was her greatest social triumph and her deepest source of embarrassment, all rolled into one. It had established her as a detective, but it had also firmly established her as a cheat. "I have retired from professional detective work," Agatha said haughtily, though her heart gave a traitorous little flutter at the memory of the attention. "And my baking skills have improved immensely. I find it relaxing. Relaxing." "You look like you're about to murder someone, not eat cake," drawled a voice from behind her. Agatha turned, her expression softening immediately. It was James Lacey, her handsome, infuriating, and tragically unobtainable neighbour. He looked devastatingly attractive in a casual tweed jacket. "James." Agatha beamed, her London face slipping for a moment. "Are you here to support me?" James eyed her near-perfect Victoria sponge. "I am here for the beer tent, actually, but I see you've gone all out." He nodded at her cake. "It certainly looks like something yowed by in Harrods." Agatha felt a cold dread sink into her stomach. Did everyone know? Was she that transparent? Her pride, so carefully cultivated, felt brittle enough to snap. "Don't be ridiculous, James," she said, her voice rising in defensive hysteria. "I spent all night baking this. I have flour in places I didn't know had places." Before James could reply, the official announcer, old Colonel Lacey, no relation to Jamess Endless Relief, stepped up to the microphone, which shrieked with feedback. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the judging. We are honoured to have as our esteemed guest judge this year the delightful, the incomparable, Mrs. Brenda Harrison." A collective intake of breath swept through the hall. Brenda Harrison was a village legend, not for her baking, but for her tongue. She was the matriarch of Carsely's old guard, a woman whose disapproval could social climb you into exile, and whose approval was more sought after than a knighthood. She was also, inconveniently, the aunt of Gemma's ex-fiancé. Brenda, a woman who resembled a well-dressed aggressive turtle, stepped forward. She wore a hat with enough feathers to start a small aviary, and carried a silver cake slice as if it were a weapon. "Let's see what we have here," Brenda declared, her voice a low growl. "I hope they aren't all as soggy as last year. The vicar's scones nearly broke my molar." She began her progress down the long table. Agatha's heart hammered a frantic rhythm. She saw James edging away toward the exit and the promised beer tent. "No, James, you must stay," Agatha hissed, grabbing his sleeve. "You're my good luck charm." "I am a good luck charm for failure, then," he muttered. But he didn't pull away. Agatha felt a surge of purely irrational joy. Brenda was approaching Margaret Bloomsbury's lemon drizzle. Margaret preened. Brenda poked the cake with her silver slice. "Lopsided, overbeaten eggs, and it smells of artifice." Margaret went pale. "It's organic lemon oil. It smells like furniture polish," Brenda declared, moving on. Agatha suppressed a giggle. Margaret glared at her. And then Brenda was in front of Agatha's table. She paused. She eyed the perfect sponge. She looked up at Agatha, her small eyes narrowing. "And this must be Mrs. Raisin's entry," Brenda said, her tone dripping with faux sweetness. "The celebrated Mrs. Raisin." Agatha lifted her chin. "Just Agatha, please." "And yes, it is." Brenda leaned in closer. "It certainly looks professional." She picked up the cake slice. "Almost too professional." Agatha's throat felt as if it had been sealed with wax. "Well, aye, but let's see how it tastes," Brenda interrupted. She drove the silver slice into the heart of the victorious sponge with a viciousness that felt personal. She lifted a small piece on the slice, brought it to her lips, and took a bite. The hall fell into a silence so profound that the buzzing of a fly against the window sounded like a chainsaw. Everyone watched. Brenda Harrison chewed slowly, thoughtfully. Her face, however, did not register approval. It didn't register disapproval. Instead, a look of profound, terrifying confusion washed over her, followed instantly by a spasm of pain. Brenda gasped, dropping the silver cake slice. It clattered to the floor, the sound echoing in the silence. Her hand flew to her throat. "Brenda?" Colonel Lacey stepped forward, concerned. "Are you all right?" Brenda tried to speak, but only a wet, gurgling sound emerged. Her eyes, magnified by her thick glasses, were wide with an almost comical panic. She began to stagger backwards, fanning her face as if overheated. "Good heavens!" Margaret shrieked. "She's choking on the sheer perfection." "Don't be ridiculous," Agatha snapped, though her own heart was now a cold lump in her chest. "Is there a doctor? James, do something." James, with admirable presence of mind, moved to perform the Heimlich maneuver, but Brenda waved him away with a surprisingly powerful flail of her arm. She was turning a very alarming shade of red. "Water. Give her water," Agatha shouted, grabbing a glass from a nearby table. She shoved it into Brenda's hand. Brenda grabbed the glass with a desperate, clawing grip and tried to bring it to her mouth, but her hands were shaking too violently. The water splashed across her feathered hat and her dress. She choked again, a harsh, rattling sound, and then, with a terrible, slow grace, her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the polished wooden floor of the village hall, the glass of water shattering beside her. "Call an ambulance," the colonel bellowed. The hall erupted into chaos. Villagers were screaming, gasping, and pushing forward to see. Agatha stood frozen, the half-eaten slice of her London-bought Victoria sponge glaring up at her. She's had a heart attack," Margaret cried out, her voice tremble-free and suspiciously dramatic. "She was fine 2 seconds ago." Agatha defended herself, though no one had actually accused her of anything. Yet. The minutes that followed were a blur of screaming sirens, the arrival of paramedics, and the polite yet firm pushing back of the crowd. Agatha found herself standing next to James. "This is terrible," she whispered, her PR-trained brain already calculating the fallout. "The publicity will be atrocious. Someone's just collapsed, potentially died, and you're worried about publicity." James looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and, she thought, a touch of admiration for her sheer audacity. "Well, yes," Agatha retorted, her pride roaring back. "Do you know how hard I worked on that that cake? If it's poisoned—" Her voice faltered. She hadn't meant to say that. The word hanging in the air felt like a confession. "Let's not jump to conclusions," James said, but his eyes had sharpened. "She's an elderly woman. It was a stressful event." The paramedics were working on Brenda with an urgency that didn't look hopeful. Finally, the lead paramedic shook his head. He pulled a sheet over Brenda Harrison's face. A collective wail went up from the village hall. Brenda was gone. Colonel Lacey, looking 10 years older, stepped toward the stunned crowd. I'm afraid Brenda Harrison has passed away." Silence. Total consuming silence. The annual Carsely Charity Bake-Off had just become a crime scene, or at the very least, a scene of natural death that was extremely inconvenient. "Well," Margaret Bloomsbury's voice cut through the air, sharp and triumphant. "I suppose we know whose cake won that category." She pointed a finger, index and accusing, directly at Agatha. "I always said her baking was to die for." Agatha felt every eye in the hall turned toward her. Her London face was gone now, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated, social panic. "It wasn't poisoned!" Agatha yelled, her voice breaking. "It was Harrods!" It was delicious. "I ate some myself." She hadn't. "Harrods?" James repeated, a small smile playing on his lips. "You bought your bake-off entry from Harrods, Agatha." The social humiliation was absolute. The only thing that could make this worse was if the doors to the village hall swung open, and a man in a rumpled suit, with eyes that looked perpetually tired, stepped inside. "Inspector Wilkes," Agatha groaned. The man who hated her more than anyone else in the world, and the only policeman she knew who considered common sense a secondary investigative tool. Wilkes surveyed the scene, his gaze landing first on Brenda's body, then on the broken glass, and finally on Agatha Raisin. Well, well, Wilkes said, his voice flat. Mrs. Raisin, I should have known. Oh, wherever there's drama, you're never far behind. He walked toward Brenda's body. Natural causes, the paramedic says. But with you present, Agatha, I'm never quite sure. Agatha Raisin, social climber, failed baker, and erstwhile detective, looked from the body of Brenda Harrison to the accusing eyes of the village, and then to the closed expression of James Lacey. I didn't do it, she shouted to the room. But in the recesses of her mind, a switch had been flipped. The annoyance of social failure was being overridden by a much more powerful, much more dangerous feeling. Curiosity. Because as Agatha looked at Brenda's body, she noticed something. A small detail that everyone else was too dramatic or too polite to see. Brenda Harrison hadn't just choked. She'd been poisoned. And Agatha, the woman who had brought the cake, was the obvious suspect. Her choice was simple. Face total social ruin as a charlatan baker and a potential murderer, or find out who had actually killed Brenda Harrison. She looked at her half-eaten Victoria sponge. The game once again was afoot. And Agatha Raisin, despite her absolute fury at the inconvenience, was already mentally packing her investigating face. This was going to be a disaster, and she was going to be right at the center of it. Chapter 2. The Harrods' humiliation, the departure of Brenda Harrison's mortal remains in a black body bag, was in Agatha's professional opinion as a former PR mogul, a public relations disaster of the highest order. It wasn't just the death, it was the timing. The annual bake-off was supposed to be the jewel in Carsely's social crown, a day of bunting, polite rivalry, and perhaps a mild case of indigestion. It was not supposed to be a crime scene. And it certainly wasn't supposed to be the venue for Agatha's most shameful secret to be broadcast to the entire parish. Harrods, Agatha, really? Margaret Bloomsbury's voice was like a mosquito, persistent, annoying, and thirsty for blood. She had gathered a small circle of village matrons near the tea urn, all of whom were looking at Agatha with a mixture of horror and delicious triumph. Agatha straightened her silk suit jacket, feeling the heat rise to her cheeks. It was an emergency, Margaret. My oven, it suffered a catastrophic thermal failure. I had no choice but to provide a replacement of equal quality. A replacement you entered as your own work, piped up Mrs. Witherspoon, a woman whose own Victoria sponge resembled a squashed hat. That's fraud, dear. Pure and simple. It's resourcefulness, Agatha snapped, though she knew she was losing ground. In London we call it outsourcing. And in the Cotswolds we call it cheating, James Lacey remarked, joining them. He looked far too calm for a man who had just witnessed a neighbour expire over a sponge cake. Agatha turned her glare on him. I don't recall asking for your input, James. Shouldn't you be at the beer tent? Or perhaps writing one of your dull history books? James gave her a dry, infuriatingly handsome smile. I find the current history being made right here far more interesting, especially since Inspector Wilkes looks like he's about to have a word with you. Agatha's stomach did a slow, painful somersault. Sure enough, Inspector Wilkes was detaching himself from a conversation with the paramedics and heading her way. He was a man who looked like he had been constructed entirely out of grey wool and resentment. Mrs. Wilkes said, stopping in front of her. Oh. He pulled out a small notebook, flicking through pages that Agatha was certain were filled with previous grievances against her. A tragic business. Brenda Harrison was a pillar of the community. She was a nosy old bird who hated everyone, Agatha muttered under her breath. I heard that, Wilkes said flatly. Now, about this cake. You claim it's from Harrods? I didn't claim it, Agatha lied through her teeth. I merely allowed the assumption to stand, but it is from Harrods. Yes, Agatha hissed, her pride finally shattering. The food hall, best in London. Not that you'd know anything about quality, Inspector. Wilkes ignored the jab. The paramedics mentioned a strange odour, and some unusual discoloration in the centre of the slice, Mrs. Harrison consumed. Tell me, did you add anything to this cake? Any special ingredients to ensure a win? Agatha felt a surge of genuine outrage. Are you accusing me of poisoning a woman over a silver-plated trophy and a £50 voucher for the garden centre? I may be ambitious, Inspector, but I am not insane. If I wanted Brenda dead, I would have used my bare hands during the last parish council meeting. Your violent tendencies are noted, Wilkes said, scribbling. We'll be taking the cake for analysis. And the water glass. The water. Agatha's eyes widened. She remembered Brenda's desperate grab for the glass she had handed her. She didn't start really rattling until she drank the water. She was already choking, Agatha, James pointed out gently. No, James, listen. She took the bite, she looked confused, yes. But the moment she drank, she went down like a felled oak. I saw her face. It wasn't just choking. It was as if her throat had turned to lead. Wilkes looked at her with profound boredom. Thank you, Mrs. Raisin. Well, leave the forensics to the professionals. In the meantime, I suggest you stay in the village. Not that you could go anywhere in that flashy car of yours without being noticed. He turned on his heel and walked away, gesturing for a constable to bag the remnants of Agatha's expensive, murderous Harrods cake. The crowd began to disperse, the thrill of the tragedy fading into the reality of a ruined Saturday. Agatha stood in the centre of the hall, feeling strangely isolated. Even James had drifted away to speak to the colonel. She felt the weight of the villagers' judgment pressing in on her. They didn't just think she was a cheat, they thought she was a jinx. A black widow in a designer suit. Agatha! She turned to see Bill Wong, the young, friendly detective sergeant, who was the only member of the local police force she actually liked. He looked genuinely concerned. Bill, tell me they don't seriously think I did it, she pleaded, reaching out to touch his arm. Bill sighed, looking around to make sure Wilkes wasn't watching. Look, Agatha, the inspector is the inspector. But Brenda Harrison wasn't exactly a healthy woman. Heart failure is the working theory. However, he lowered his voice. There was something odd. A smell of bitter almonds. Very fay. Agatha's heart leapt. Cyanide? Maybe. Or maybe just an almond-flavoured filling gone wrong. But the thing is, Agatha, if that cake came from Harrods, and it is poisoned, you're in the clear. They wouldn't poison their own stock. Exactly. Agatha cheered up instantly. Unless, Bill added, his expression darkening, someone tampered with it after it left the shop. Like, say, during the 2 hours it sat on your kitchen counter. Oh, while it was sitting on the display table here. Agatha's brief moment of relief vanished. She looked toward the long tables, now mostly empty. She remembered the bustling crowd, the hovering bakers, the helpful neighbours who had helped her arrange her display. Any one of them could have slipped something into the cake, or the water, or onto the silver slice Brenda had used. I need to know who was near my table, Bill, Agatha said, her voice dropping into her executive power register. Agatha, stay out of it. Let us handle it, and let Wilkes pin it on me because I am an outsider who buys her cakes in London. Not a chance. She turned away from Bill, her mind racing. Her social standing was in tatters, her romantic prospects with James were currently sub-zero, and she was a prime suspect in a murder investigation. It was, she decided, the perfect time to start asking questions that would make everyone in Carsely wish they'd stayed home and baked bread. She headed for the exit, spotting Margaret Bloomsbury tucking a Tupperware container into her bag with suspicious haste. Heading home to hide the evidence. Margaret? Agatha called out, her voice ringing across the hall. Margaret froze, her face pale. I am just taking my lemon drizzle home. No sense in letting it go to waste. Funny, Agatha said, walking toward her with a predatory stride. Brenda said your cake smelled like furniture polish. I wonder, what is your secret ingredient, dear? The game hadn't just begun. Agatha had just kicked the ball directly into the neighbour's window, and she didn't care one bit about the glass. Oh. Chapter 3. Gin, cats, and cold shoulders. Agatha Raisin sat at her scrubbed pine kitchen table in her cottage in Carsely, nursing a gin and tonic that was approximately 80% gin. Her two cats, Hodge and Boswell, sat on the counter, watching her with the judgmental, unblinking stares that only felines and Cotswold villagers can master. Oh, shut up, Agatha muttered to Hodge, who let out a soft, mournful meow. It was a perfectly good cake. Harrods doesn't just poison people, it's bad for the brand. She felt a familiar, hot prickle of tears behind her eyes, not for Brenda Harrison, whom she had found mostly intolerable, but for her own shredded reputation. The Harrods' humiliation would be the talk of the village for years. She could already see the headlines in the Cotswold Times. London blow-in bakes death. Worse than the social death, however, was the memory of James Lacey's face. He hadn't looked disgusted, exactly had looked amused. To Agatha, a man's amusement was often more painful than his anger. It meant she wasn't being taken seriously. I'll show them, Agatha declared, slamming her glass down. I'll find out who did it, and then they'll have to invite me to their bloody dinner parties. They'll owe me. She stood up, smoothed her expensive wool skirt, and checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. Her face was a bit flushed from the gin, and her blonde bob was slightly windswept, but she still looked like a woman who could command a boardroom, or, at the very least, a woman who could bully a small-town grocery store clerk. Agatha marched out of her cottage and down the lane toward the village shop. Oh. The evening air was cool and smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, a quintessential cozy scent that usually made her feel smug about her escape from London. Today, it felt oppressive. As she walked, she noticed Mrs. Perry Jenkins across the street. Usually the woman would wave a manicured hand and offer some passive-aggressive comment about Agatha's garden. Today she suddenly became very interested in a dead dandelion in her flower bed, turning her back completely as Agatha passed. "Lovely evening, isn't it, Mrs. Perry Jenkins?" Agatha called out, her voice dripping with artificial cheer. The woman didn't move. I said, Agatha shouted, "Lovely evening." Mrs. Perry Jenkins gave a sharp, terrified little hop and scurried toward her front door without looking back. Agatha's jaw tightened. Right, the pariah treatment. I see how it is. She reached the village shop, the hub of Carsely's gossip mill. Mrs. The shopkeeper was behind the counter, weighing out sweets for a small boy. When Agatha entered, the bell chimed with a cheerful ting that felt entirely inappropriate. Two other villagers, Mrs. Bloxby, the vicar's wife, the only person in the village Agatha genuinely respected, and a younger woman Agatha didn't recognize were standing by the magazine rack. They stopped talking the moment Agatha stepped inside. "Milk, please, Mrs. Mason," Agatha said, marching to the counter, "and a packet of those expensive chocolate digestives, the ones with the thick coating. I've had a stressful day." Mrs. Mason placed the milk on the counter, as if she were handling radioactive waste. "It's been a stressful day for everyone, Mrs. Raisin. Poor Brenda. Such a shock. It was a disaster," Agatha said, her bluntness overriding her common sense. "Let's be honest, Mrs. Brenda Harrison wasn't exactly poor Brenda when she was alive, was she? She was a tyrant in a floral hat. Half the village wanted her silenced, and someone finally had the initiative to do it." A collective gasp echoed through the small shop. The younger woman by the magazines looked as if she might faint. "Agatha, dear Mrs. Bloxby said gently, stepping forward. "Perhaps now isn't the best time for such directness." "Why not?" Agatha turned on her, her eyes flashing. "The police are currently testing my Harrods Victoria sponge for arsenic. My reputation is being examined under a microscope. If we're going to talk about Brenda, let's talk about why she was arguing with that young man behind the village hall 10 minutes before the judging started." This was a lie. Agatha hadn't seen Brenda arguing with any N.M. but she knew from years in PR that if you throw enough bait, someone eventually bites. "Mrs. Mason's eyes widened. "An argument? With a young man? You don't mean Peter Harrison, surely?" "Her nephew?" Agatha leaned in, her instincts humming. "Peter, was it? Tall, looking a bit ragged around the edges?" They seemed quite heated. The younger woman spoke up, her voice trembling. "Peter has a right to be upset. Brenda was going to cut him out of her will. She told everyone at the bridge club that he was a disgrace to the Harrison name, just because he wanted to sell his share of the family farm to that housing developer." "Ah," Agatha said, a predatory smile touching her lips. "Property and money, the two great Cotswold motives. And where is Peter now?" "He left right after the incident, Mrs. Mason whispered, looking like a ghost he was." "And didn't he help set up the tables this morning?" Agatha added, her mind racing. "I seem to remember someone in a wax jacket hovering near my Victoria sponge while I was chatting with James Lacey." Mrs. nodded slowly. "He was helping with the heavy lifting. He did have access to the tables." "And the water carafe?" Agatha pressed. "I suppose so." Agatha grabbed her milk and her biscuits. "There you have it. A clear motive and opportunity. But Wilkes would rather blame the woman from London because she's an outsider." "Agatha, Mrs. Bloxby said, her voice filled with a quiet warning. "Be careful. Peter is a troubled boy, but that doesn't make him a murderer. And Brenda had many disagreements. It wasn't just Peter." "Oh." "Who else?" Agatha asked, her hand on the door handle. Mrs. Bloxby hesitated. She was very vocal about the new curate's modernist views. "And then there's the matter of Margaret Bloomsbury's husband." Agatha froze. "What about Margaret's husband?" "Brenda claims she saw him in Evesham last month," Mrs. Mason chimed in, unable to help herself. "With a woman who was definitely not Margaret. Brenda was planning to counsel Margaret about it tonight. She said a village like Carsely had no room for such moral rot." Agatha felt a thrill of excitement. A disgruntled nephew, a threatened curate, and a jealous rival whose marriage was about to be blown apart. "Well," Agatha said, her confidence restored, It seems my victorious sponge was just the stage for a very busy afternoon of potential homicides. Good evening, ladies. She stepped out into the twilight, her mind whirring. She needed to find Peter Harrison. But first, she needed to see if Margaret Bloomsbury's husband had a reliable alibi for the duration of the bake-off. She was so lost in thought that she almost walked directly into a dark figure standing by her garden gate. Checking for more poison, Agatha? It was James Lacey. He was leaning against the stone wall, looking infuriatingly composed. Checking for suspects, James. Agatha snapped, pushing past him to her gate. And if you're here to mock my baking again, you can go back to your history books. Actually, James said, his voice softening, I am here because Peter Harrison just crashed his car into the village pond. The police are there now. They found a small bottle of something in his pocket. Agatha's heart hammered. What kind of something? The kind of something that smells like bitter almonds, James replied. Agatha looked at him, her pride warring with her detective's itch. Well, what are you waiting for? My car is faster than yours. Let's go. Chapter 4. The dampness of guilt. Agatha's silver BMW screeched to a halt near the village pond, narrowly missing a stray sheep and a very startled Constable Wong. She killed the engine and stepped out, her high heels sinking instantly into the mud of the verge. Blast! She hissed, looking down at her ruined suede pumps. These were £200 on Bond Street. A small price to pay for justice, surely, James said, climbing out of the passenger side with the annoying agility of someone who wore sensible brogues. The scene was illuminated by the flickering blue lights of a police van. The village pond, usually a picturesque spot for ducks and the occasional romantic stroll, now looked like a murky cauldron. Peter Harrison's old, battered Land Rover was angled nose first into the water, its tail lights still glowing like the eyes of a dying swamp monster. Peter himself was sitting on the grass, draped in a grey police blanket. He was shivering violently, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. Inspector Wilkes stood over him, looking remarkably pleased with himself. Ah! The detective duo arrives, Wilkes said, not looking up from his notebook. Stay behind the tape, Mrs. Raisin. This is a restricted area. Nonsense, Inspector, Agatha said, ducking under the tape anyway. I'm a person of interest, remember? You said so yourself at the hall. I have a vested interest in seeing if my accomplice survives. Wilkes scowled. He's lucky to be alive. Tried to take a sharp corner at 60 or so, it seems. Or perhaps he was trying to make a watery exit from his problems. Agatha marched over to Peter. The young man looked up, his eyes wide and glazed with shock. Up close, he didn't look like a calculating murderer. He looked like a boy who had lost his favourite toy and then been hit by a bus. Peter, Agatha said, her voice uncharacteristically soft, a tactic she used to use on difficult journalists. Why were you running? Peter's teeth chattered. I wasn't. I just had to get away. Everyone was looking at me. Like they knew. Knew what? James asked, crouching beside Agatha. That I hated her. Peter burst out, his voice cracking. I hated Aunt Brenda. She was a cruel, miserable woman who wanted to control everything. She was going to ruin me. She was going to take the farm and turn it into a bird sanctuary just to spite me. And so you decided to turn her Victoria sponge into a final meal, Wilkes interjected, stepping closer. He held up a small, clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was a tiny brown glass bottle with a torn label. Care to explain this, lad? Found it in your jacket pocket. Ah, smells like a chemistry set. Agatha leaned in, sniffing the air near the bag. There it was, a gantive faint, cloying scent of bitter almonds. It was a smell that usually heralded a dramatic climax in a Christie novel, but here, in the damp Cotswold night, it felt strangely out of place. It's oil, Peter wailed. For my skin, I have a condition that requires almond-scented poison. Wilkes smirked. I think Yal'll find the lab has a different name for it. It's not poison. Peter slumped back against the police van. I didn't do anything to the cake. I didn't even go near the Harrods box. Agatha's ears pricked up. How did you know it was a Harrods box, Peter? I kept it covered with a tea towel until the very last moment. Peter blinked, confused. Everyone knew. Margaret Bloomsbury was whispering about it before the judging even started. She said she saw you sneaking it in from your car like a thief in the night. Agatha felt a fresh wave of fury toward Margaret. That meddling beige-clad harpy, she hissed. Be that as it may, Wilkes said. We have a motive, we have opportunity, we're setting up the table sand, we have the substance. It's a clean sweep. You can go home now, Mrs. Raisin. Your innocence is looking more likely, though I still think you should be fined for that cake-buying stunt. Agatha looked at Peter. He was weeping now, a silent, pathetic shaking of his shoulders. She looked at the bottle in the bag. Something didn't sit right. It was too easy. The obvious suspect was sitting right there, practically gift-wrapped in a wet blanket. "Wait a minute," Agatha said, her eyes narrowing. "Peter, if you were going to kill her, why would you do it at the bake-off? In front of everyone? Why not just, put it in her nightly gin and tonic? You lived in the same house." "Because he's a fool," Wilkes said. "No," Agatha countered, her London PR brain clicking into gear. "Even a fool knows that a public murder is a one-way ticket to Broadmoor. And look at that bottle. The label is torn. It looks old. If you're going to buy cyanide, you don't carry it around in a dusty bottle in your pocket while driving into a pond." "Maybe he wanted to kill himself too," James suggested, though he sounded skeptical. "I didn't," Peter cried. "The brakes, they didn't work. I stepped on the pedal and nothing happened. That's why I went in." Wilkes laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "The old brakes failed excuse. Classic. Well, check the vehicle, but I think we've got our man." Agatha watched as they bundled Peter into the back of the police van. She felt a strange, nagging sensation in the back of her mind, same feeling she got when a press release had a typo she couldn't quite find. "He didn't do it, James," she said as the van drove away. Its sirens silent now, leaving the pond in a heavy, humid quiet. "He has the poison in his pocket, Agatha. It's a bit of a smoking gun, don't you think? It's a smoking cannon, which is exactly why it's wrong. It's too loud. It's too obvious." Agatha turned to James, her eyes bright with a sudden, sharp intelligence. Someone wanted Peter to be caught. Someone knew he was the perfect scapegoat. The nephew with the grudge, the financial trouble, the shaky nerves. James crossed his arms. And who would know all that? "Anyone in the village who listens to Brenda Harrison's counselling sessions," Agatha said. She began to walk back to her car, her ruined heels forgotten. "We need to find out who else was at that hall early. And more importantly, we need to find out what happened to the rest of that water carafe. Agatha, Wilkes told you to stay out of it." "Wilkes is an idiot who wouldn't know a murderer if they sat on his lap and confessed," Agatha snapped, opening her car door. "I have a reputation to rebuild, James. And I can't do that if the village thinks I am just the lady who got lucky because the real killer was a clumsy boy." She sat in the driver's seat and looked at James. "Are you coming? Or are you going to stay here and talk to the ducks?" James sighed, but there was a glint of excitement in his eyes that he couldn't quite hide. He got in. "Where to?" "To the person who saw everything and tells everyone," Agatha said, a predatory smile on her face. "We're going to pay a visit to Margaret Bloomsbury. I want to see if she's finished that lemon drizzle yet." Chapter 5. A spoonful of malice. Margaret Bloomsbury lived in a house called the Beeches, despite the fact that the only trees in her meticulously manicured garden were 2 spindly silver birches and a very depressed-looking laurel. To Agatha, the house looked exactly like its owner, beige, slightly too symmetrical, and radiating an aura of suffocating moral superiority. "Are you sure about this, Agatha?" James asked as they walked up the gravel path. "Margaret is likely in mourning, or at least in whatever version of mourning involves polishing one's silver with extra vigor." "She's in mourning for her lost opportunity to win a plastic trophy," Agatha retorted, smoothing her hair. She felt a twinge of insecurity. The damp air from the pond had turned her expensive blowout into something resembling a haystack. "And don't you dare be charming to her, James. We're here for information, not a tea party." Agatha didn't wait to knock. She tried the handle. It was locked. She hammered on the door with a force that suggested she was either a debt collector or the police. After a few moments, the door opened a crack. Margaret Bloomsbury peered out, her eyes red-rimmed, though Agatha suspected this was more from the fumes of the industrial-strength bleach she was clearly using than from grief. "Ah, it's you," Margaret said, her voice dropping an octave, on James. "I suppose you've come to gloat now that Peter has been arrested." "Gloat? I am here to offer my condolences," Agatha said, pushing her way past Margaret into the hallway. The smell of lemon-scented floor wax was so thick it made her eyes water. "And to ask why you told everyone I bought my cake at Harrods before I'd even taken it out of the car." Margaret stiffened, her hand fluttering to the collar of her beige cardigan. "I saw the bag, Agatha. It was quite obvious. Some of us actually value the spirit of the competition." "The spirit of the competition didn't kill Brenda," Agatha snapped, marching into the kitchen. The kitchen was terrifyingly clean. It looked like a surgery room where the primary operation was the production of mediocre scones. On the counter sat the remnants of Margaret's lemon drizzle cake. "So," Agatha said, circling the kitchen island like a shark. "You were on the refreshments committee today, weren't you, Margaret? You were the one responsible for the water carafes and the silver cake slices." "I was one of the people," Margaret corrected, her voice trembling. Mrs. Witherspoon and the curate's wife were also there. "We all worked very hard, unlike some people who just drive to London and back." James, seeing Agatha's temper beginning to simmer, stepped in. "Margaret, we're just trying to piece things together." Agatha noticed that Brenda seemed to react quite strongly to the water. "Did you notice anyone near the jugs before the judging began?" Margaret's expression shifted from defensive to cagey. "I was far too busy to play spy, James. I had 34 cups to keep filled." Although, she added, a glint of malice returning to her eyes, "I did see that young curate, Mr. Arbuthnot, talking to Brenda near the drinks table. She was giving him a piece of her mind about the new youth group. Said they were bringing the smells and bells of the city into the village. She was quite loud about it." Agatha wasn't listening to the gossip about the curate. Her eyes had landed on a small, open rubbish bin under the sink. Margaret had been cleaning, and the bin was nearly full of discarded paper towels and empty containers. "Is that a new bottle of almond extract, Margaret?" Agatha asked, pointing to a small blue bottle peeking out from under a pile of lemon rinds. Margaret turned pale. "I use it for my marzipan. For the Harvest Festival. The Harvest Festival is 6 weeks away," Agatha noted. She leaned over, reaching into the bin to grab the bottle. "Agatha, don't be disgusting," James muttered. As Agatha reached down, her heel already weakened by the mud at the pond gave way. With a cry of, "Oh, bloody hell," she lunged forward, her hands slamming into the counter to steady herself. In the process, she knocked over a heavy ceramic jar of flour, which exploded upward in a white cloud, coating her silk suit, her face, and her hair. "My kitchen," Margaret shrieked. Agatha stood there, looking like a disgruntled ghost. She spat out a mouthful of flour and glared at Margaret through white-coated eyelashes. "Ah, he'll pay for a cleaner," Agatha wheezed. But her hand was still inside the bin, and it had closed around something that wasn't a bottle of almond extract. She pulled her hand out. It wasn't the blue bottle. It was a pair of thin, disposable latex gloves. They were stained with something yellowish-brown. "Getting some DIY surgery done, Margaret?" Agatha asked, her voice sharp despite the flour. "Those are for the bleach," Margaret stammered, her face now a matching shade of beige to her walls. "I have sensitive skin. Bleach doesn't leave brown stains," James observed, stepping closer. He took a small plastic bag from his pocket, always seemed prepared for Agatha's mishaps, and took the gloves from her. Agatha, feeling a sudden surge of triumph that outweighed her embarrassment, turned back to Margaret. "You were very quick to point the finger at Peter, and very quick to tell everyone about my Harrod's cake, almost as if you wanted everyone to look at us while you were busy refreshing the water." "Get out!" Margaret yelled, her voice hitting a high, hysterical note. "Get out of my house before I call the police." "The police are already busy with Peter," Agatha said, dusting a cloud of flour off her shoulder. "But I think they might be interested in why a woman who is so obsessed with purity is throwing away surgical gloves stained with what smells suspiciously like concentrated almond oil." She turned to James, her chin held high, despite the white powder falling from her bob like snow. "Come, James. We've seen enough. And Margaret? I'd check your husband's credit card statements if I were you. Brenda mentioned something about Evesham, didn't she? A moral rot? Ah, the look of pure, unadulterated hatred on Margaret's face was the most honest thing Agatha had seen all day. As they walked back to the car, James looked at the flour-covered Agatha with a mixture of pity and wonder. "You realize you look like a very expensive sourdough loaf." "Shut up, James," Agatha said, though she couldn't help the small smile of satisfaction. "I found the gloves. Now we just need to find out where she got the poison. And why she was so desperate to kill Brenda that she'd risk doing it in public." "Maybe she didn't," James said thoughtfully. "Maybe the poison wasn't meant for Brenda at all." Agatha froze with her hand on the car door. "What do you mean?" "Brenda was the judge, Agatha. She ate a bit of everyone's cake. But she only drank from the glass you handed her. The glass you took from the table where your cake was sitting." Agatha felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Are you saying someone was trying to kill me?" Chapter 6. The paranoia of the potted plant, the idea that someone might actually want to murder her was, frankly, the most insulting thing that had happened to Agatha all day. It was worse than being caught with a shop-bought cake. It was even worse than being covered in Margaret Bloomsbury's aggressive bread flour. "Me?" Agatha demanded, scrubbing a stubborn patch of white powder from her ear with a damp flannel. She was back in her cottage, having left James at his gate with a sharp good night that was meant to hide her trembling hands. Why on earth would anyone want to kill me? I've been a model citizen. Hodge, her black cat, blinked at her from the laundry basket. He looked skeptical. All right, so I've had the occasional row. Agatha conceded to the empty room. I might have suggested that the parish council is a collection of geriatric barnacles. But murder, it's so excessive. She looked at her reflection. Her face was red from scrubbing, and her eyes looked wide and watery. The vulnerability she usually kept under wraps, the fear that she was just an unwanted city interloper ignored at her. If James was right, the water-glass shed handed Brenda hadn't been a weapon for the judge, it had been a booby trap meant for the woman who brought the Harrods sponge. Agatha poured herself another gin, purely for medicinal purposes, and sat down to think. If she were the target, the motive had to be recent. She ran through her recent PR triumphs and village skirmishes. Shed offended the bell ringers by complaining about the Tuesday practice. Shed insulted the postman's driving. But then there was the big one. She'd been asking far too many questions about the new luxury housing development slated for the edge of the village. Money, Agatha whispered. It always comes back to the money. But then, Brenda Harrison had been the one with the power to stop the development. If Brenda was dead, the development went through. If Agatha was dead, well, the village would just be a slightly quieter place. Determined to find clarity and needing to escape the suffocating silence of her own paranoia, Agatha decided to visit the only person in Carsely who didn't seem to want her dead, Mrs. Bloxby, the vicar's wife. The vicarage was a drafty, ivy-clad building that always smelled of floor wax and sincerity. Mrs. Bloxby received Agatha in the parlour with her usual serene kindness, seemingly unbothered by the fact that it was nearly 9 o'clock. Agatha, you look as though you've had a fright, Mrs. Bloxby said, pouring from a cracked porcelain pot. I've been covered in flour, insulted by a policeman, and told I am a target for an assassin, Agatha said, taking a large, unladylike gulp of tea. Apart from that, it's been a standard Saturday. Mrs. Bloxby sat down, her hands folded in her lap. James told you his theory, I take it. He can be a bit dramatic. He's usually right, which is the most annoying thing about him. Agatha sighed. But tell me, Margaret Bloomsbury. She was cleaning her kitchen like a woman possessed tonight, and I found latex gloves in her bin, stained brown. Mrs. Bloxby's brow furrowed. Margaret is a very proud woman, Agatha. Her husband Arthur has been travelling a lot lately. Brenda Harrison had a way of finding out things people preferred to keep hidden. She called it spiritual guidance, but the village saw it as blackmail adjacent. So Brenda knew about Arthur's little trips to Evesham, Agatha said, her eyes narrowing. And Margaret knew that Brenda was going to spill the beans at the bake-off. A public humiliation in front of the whole village. It's possible, Mrs. Bloxby admitted, but there's also the matter of Mr. Arbuthnot, our new curate. He's a very modern young man. He wants to sell the old church silver to fund a community outreach program. Brenda was leading the charge to have him defrocked for heresy. Agatha leaned forward. A curate who needs money. A wife who needs silence. A nephew who needs a farm. It's a regular buffet of suspects. And then there is you, Agatha, Mrs. Bloxby said softly. You've been very vocal about the planning permission for the Harrison land. You told the developer, Mr. Sanford, that you would burn his reputation to the ground if he touched the ancient hedgerows. Agatha waved a hand dismissively. That was just professional rhetoric. Mr. Sanford didn't take it that way. He was at the bake-off today. He was the one who donated the water carafes. He's a very generous man on the surface. Agatha felt a cold prickle at the base of her neck. The water, the carafe, Sanford. I need to talk to him, Agatha declared, standing up. At this hour, Agatha, please be sensible. Stay here. The vicar is in the study. You're safe here. I am never safe when I am being sensible, Margaret, Agatha said, accidentally calling Mrs. by her first name in her excitement. If Sanford tried to poison me to clear the way for his ugly little houses, he's going to find out that PR professionals are much harder to kill than elderly aunts. She marched out of the vicarage, her courage bolstered by the tea and the lingering gin. As she walked toward her car, she noticed a shadow move near the churchyard gate. She froze. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice echoing off the ancient stone walls. No answer, only the rustle of the wind in the yew trees. She reached her BMW and fumbled for her keys. As the interior light flickered on, she saw something sitting on the driver's seat. It was a small, white envelope. With trembling fingers she opened it. Inside was a single, typed line: "The next slice won't be from Harrods." Agatha slammed the door and locked it, her heart thumping like a trapped bird. She wasn't just a detective anymore. She was a witness, a victim, and a target. And for the first time in her life, Agatha Raisin felt that the picturesque Cotswolds were not nearly far enough away from the cold, calculating reality of London. Oh! She put the car in gear and roared away, but as she looked in the rearview mirror, she saw the headlights of a car pull out from behind the church. It stayed exactly 3 car lengths behind her all the way home. Oh! Chapter 7. The silent treatment. Agatha spent the night in a state of high-alert hysterics. Every creak of the floorboards in her cottage was a professional assassin. Every hoot of an owl was a signal to a waiting hit squad. She had barricaded her front door with a heavy oak chair and slept, if one could call it that, on the sofa with a fire poker gripped in her hand. By dawn the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a gritty, soul-crushing exhaustion and a face that looked like a crumpled paper bag. "Right," she told Boswell, who was batting at the typed note on the coffee table. "No more hiding. If someone wants to threaten Agatha Raisin, they'd better be prepared for a counter-campaign." She showered, dressed in a sharp navy suit that shouted authority, and applied enough concealer to hide a mid-sized blemish on the face of the moon. She had just finished her first coffee when the telephone rang, the sound jarring in the quiet kitchen. "Agatha?" "It's Bill Wong." The young detective sounded breathless, his usual cheery tone replaced by a grim urgency. "Bill! Thank goodness. I've been followed, I've been threatened via stationery, and Agatha, listen to me," Bill interrupted. "There's been another death." Agatha felt the air leave her lungs. "Who? Not Peter?" He was in a cell. No, not Peter. "It's Mr. Sandford, the developer." Agatha sat down heavily. "Sandford? But I was just going to go and yell at him." "What happened?" "His housekeeper found him this morning. He was in his study at the manor. It looks like he took a fall down the stairs, but the paramedics found something in his mouth. A piece of almond-scented paste. The same poison," Agatha whispered. "But why? If he was the one who donated the water carafes, why would he kill himself?" "We don't think he did," Bill said, his voice dropping. "The scene was staged, Agatha. Badly. Someone wanted it to look like a suicide of guilt, but Sandford was a man who wouldn't feel guilty if he bulldozed an orphanage. Wilkes is having a fit. He's released Peter Harrison because the timing doesn't work. Peter was in custody when Sandford died." "So the killer is still out there," Agatha said, her mind racing. "And they are tidying up loose ends. Stay inside, Agatha. I mean it. Wilkes is looking for you to take a formal statement about that note you mentioned, but him telling you as a friend, keep your doors locked." Agatha hung up. Stay inside? Stay inside? That was for people who didn't have a point to prove. If Sandford was dead, the housing development was in limbo, and if Sandford hadn't been the killer, but a victim, then the entire motive shifted. She looked at the note again. "The next slice won't be from Harrods." It was a clever note, a witty note. It played on her personal embarrassment. It didn't feel like the work of a thuggish developer or a panicked nephew. It felt feminine, or at least socially attuned. She grabbed her handbag and marched out to her car, ignoring the phantom headlights she imagined in the shadows of the trees. She drove straight to the village hall. It was officially closed, but Agatha knew that the cleaning rotation would be in full swing. Inside, the hall was empty of people, but the smell of stale tea and floor wax remained. She headed straight for the kitchen annex. To her surprise, the door was ajar. Peering inside, she saw a figure hunched over the industrial sink. It was the young curate, Mr. Arbuthnot. He was frantically scrubbing something, a large glass water carafe. "A bit early for the dishes, isn't it, Vicar?" Agatha said, her voice echoing. Arbuthnot jumped, nearly dropping the glass. He was a pale, thin man with glasses that were constantly slipping down his nose. "Ah!" "You startled me. I was just helping out. The ladies were so distressed yesterday, I thought I'd take some of the burden. By washing the evidence?" Agatha stepped into the room, her eyes fixed on the carafe. "Evidence?" Arbuthnot laughed nervously. "The police took what they needed yesterday. This was just left behind in the chaos. I'm merely being a good shepherd. A shepherd who knows a lot about the value of church silver," Agatha noted, remembering Mrs. Bloxby's words. "Brenda Harrison was going to stop your little sale, wasn't she? And Sandford? Well, Sandford was going to build on church-adjacent land. He'd need the bishop's approval. Your approval." Arbuthnot's face went from pale to a sickly translucent white. I don't know what you're implying, Mrs. Raisin. Brenda was a difficult woman, but I would never save the sermon for Sunday, Agatha snapped. She walked over to the counter where several other carafes were drying. Beside them sat a small, discarded box. It was a brand new set of latex gloves, identical to the ones Shed found in Margaret's bin. Everyone seems to be worried about their hands lately, Agatha mused. The cleaning supplies are harsh. Arbuthnot defended. Agatha picked up a small damp cloth from the counter. She sniffed it. It didn't smell like almonds. It smelled of something else, something sharp and chemical. Something she recognized from her London days when Shed had her kitchen professionally degreased. Suddenly the curate's eyes darted toward the door. Agatha followed his gaze. Standing in the doorway was Margaret Bloomsbury. She wasn't wearing beige today. She was wearing a dark, sharp-shouldered coat and a look of such icy composure that Agatha felt a genuine chill. "The inspector is looking for you, Agatha," Margaret said softly. "He's at your cottage. He seems to think you might have information about Mr. Sandford's accident." "I was just discussing the washing up with the curate," Agatha said, her hand tightening on her handbag. "Mr. Arbuthnot is a very helpful man," Margaret said, stepping into the room. The curate slunk past her and out of the door without another word. Agatha and Margaret stood alone in the sterile, echoing kitchen. "You're very persistent, Agatha," Margaret said. "It's a city trait, I suppose." Not knowing when a matter is settled, Peter was the suspect. It was neat. It was tidy. It was a lie, Agatha said. "Sandford is dead. You can't pin that on Peter." "No," Margaret agreed, a strange smile touching her lips. "But we can pin it on a desperate woman who was caught cheating at a bake-off and lost her mind when the judge found out. A woman who had a grudge against the developer who threatened her view. A woman whose car was seen at the manor this morning." Agatha's heart skipped. "My car wasn't, who will they believe, Agatha? The newcomer with the London face and the fake cake? Or the grieving friend of the deceased?" Margaret stepped closer, and for the first time Agatha saw the flicker of true, calculating madness in her rival's eyes. "Go home, Agatha, while you still can." Agatha didn't wait. She bolted. She ran to her car, her heart thundering. She realized now that the obvious suspect had been a distraction, but the second death had changed the rules. This wasn't just about a cake anymore. It was about a village hierarchy that would kill to protect its secrets. And as she sped away, she realized the most terrifying thing of all. She had left her fire poker on her sofa. She was completely unarmed, and the village was closing in. Chapter 8. The high tea trap Agatha Raisin did not do vulnerable well. After a brief, undignified sob in the safety of her locked BMW, she checked her makeup in the visor mirror. She looked like a raccoon that had been through a car wash, but the fear was rapidly being replaced by a cold, hard crust of PR-honed fury. "Frame me, will she?" Agatha hissed, stabbing at her eyelashes with a mascara wand. The beche wiper. The lemon-drizzled demon. She realized that Margaret was right about one thing. The police would find it much easier to believe in the unhinged Londoner theory than to investigate the pillar of the community. To beat Margaret, Agatha couldn't rely on forensics or Inspector Wilkes' non-existent imagination. She had to use the only weapon Margaret truly feared: social catastrophe. Agatha picked up her mobile and dialed the number for the Carsely Ladies' Society emergency tree. "Mrs. Witherspoon. It's Agatha Raisin." "Yes, I know, it's been a trial. But I'm calling because I've decided to host an emergency healing tea this afternoon. At my cottage. Yes, to honour Brenda's memory and discuss the tragedy of Mr. Sandford." She heard the hesitation on the other end. "He'll be serving Harrods champagne," Agatha added silkily. "And I have it on good authority that Brenda left a final, sealed letter with her solicitors regarding the Evesham affair. I thought it only right that her closest friend should be the first to know its contents before the police arrive." The bait was swallowed with a predatory gulp. Or gossip, especially the kind that could ruin a reputation, was the only thing more powerful than fear in the Cotswolds. 2:00? Well, be there, Agatha, Mrs. Witherspoon chirped. Next, Agatha called James. "James, I need you. No don't arg. I need a witness who isn't wearing a floral print, and I need you to bring that history book of yours, one with the heavy leather binding. It needs to look like a legal ledger. Agatha, what are you planning?" Wilkes is a plodder. I'm a publicist. I'm going to stage a revelation, James. Just be there at 1:30. By 1:50, Agatha's cottage was a hive of frantic, deceptive activity. She had laid out her finest china, the stuff she usually kept for when she was feeling particularly lonely and wanted to pretend she was having tea with royalty. She had even bought more cakes, though this time she had brazenly left the London boxes on display. If she was going down, she was going down as a stylist. James arrived, looking skeptical but undeniably handsome in a dark sweater. "You look like you're preparing for a standoff at the OK Corral." "Agatha, it's the OK Cottage, James." "Did you bring the book?" He handed her the ledger. Agatha tucked a folded piece of stationery inside E.T. threatening note she had received and placed it prominently on the coffee table. "Now," Agatha said, her voice dropping, "when they arrive, I want you to look solemn. Mention the word libel occasionally. And whatever you do, don't let anyone touch the champagne until I give the signal." The guests arrived with the synchronized precision of a flock of vultures. Mrs. Witherspoon, Mrs. Bloxby, who looked at Agatha with deep concern, and finally Margaret Bloomsbury. Margaret was dressed in a suit of such severe navy blue it was practically black. She scanned the room with a practiced eye, her gaze lingering on the ledger on the table. "Agatha," Margaret said, her voice a cool breeze. "How brave of you to host us given the circumstances. I find that in times of trouble, one must circle the wagons," Agatha replied, ushering them into the sitting room. "Or at least, the tea trolleys." The atmosphere was thick with a tension that surpassed even the bake-off. Mrs. Bloxby tried to make polite conversation about the dahlias, but everyone's eyes kept darting to the ledger. Mrs. Witherspoon finally burst out, unable to contain herself. "This letter from Brenda? About Evesham?" Agatha stood up, smoothing her skirt. She looked at Margaret, who was sitting perfectly still, a cup of tea balanced on her knee. "Brenda was a very thorough woman," Agatha began, her voice ringing with the confidence of a woman announcing a major brand relaunch. "She didn't just gossip, she documented. She knew that some people in this village were living lives built on lies. Financial lies, marital lies, and she paused for dramatic effect, murderous lies." "Murder is a very strong word, Agatha," Margaret said, taking a delicate sip of tea. "It's the only word for what happened to Brenda." "Mr. Sanford," Agatha countered. "You see, I've been thinking about that water glass, the one I handed Brenda. It wasn't the cake that was poisoned. Cake was just the excuse to make Brenda drink. The poison was in the water. But it wasn't meant for me, James. It was meant for whoever was going to judge that category." She stepped closer to the coffee table, her hand hovering over the ledger. "Brenda was the judge, but the developer, Mr. Sanford, was the one who provided the carafes. He knew Brenda was going to block his housing project. He thought he was being clever, but someone else knew too. Someone who saw Sanford as a way to solve two problems at once: a husband's infidelity and a financial ruin." Margaret's hand trembled, the china clinking against the saucer. "This is absurd." "Is it?" Agatha's eyes were like flint. "I have the letter right here, Margaret. Brenda saw you meeting with Sanford. She saw the money change hands. She knew you weren't just the victim of a cheating husband, you were the one funding Sanford's project with the money Yowd embezzled from the parish hall fund." The room went deathly silent. Mrs. Witherspoon gasped. "You killed Brenda because she found out you were a thief," Agatha shouted, the tactless, brilliant detective in her taking over. "And then you killed Sanford because he was a loose end who could prove Yowd tampered with his water carafes." "You have no proof," Margaret screamed, standing up so violently her tea spilled across her expensive navy skirt. "That book is just a history of the Cotswold sheep trade. I saw the spine." Agatha froze. James froze. A slow, terrifying smile spread across Margaret's face. "You're a fro, Agatha. Just like your cake. You have nothing." "Actually," Agatha said, her heart hammering but her voice steady, "I have the gloves you threw in the bin, and I have the curate who saw you cleaning the carafes this morning. But more importantly," Agatha reached into the ledger and pulled out the typed note. "I have the note you left in my car. You see, Margaret, you're very clever, but you're also very proud. You couldn't resist making a joke about Harrods. Oh, Lee, 3 people knew I bought that cake at Harrods before it was announced. Me, James, and the person who saw me unloading it. You told me yourself you saw the bag." Margaret's face went a shade of grey that matched her usual wardrobe. "And," Agatha added, "the final blow, I took the liberty of calling the police 20 minutes ago. Bill Wong is outside. He's been listening to every word through the open window." As if on cue, the front door bell rang. Margaret looked toward the window, her composure finally, utterly shattering. She lunged not for the door, but for the champagne bottle on the table, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "If I'm going down, Raisin," she shrieked, "I'm taking your reputation with me." Chapter 9. The bitter aftertaste of revenge. Margaret Bloomsbury didn't reach for the champagne to drink it. She grabbed the heavy crystal bottle by the neck, swinging it with a desperate, unpracticed violence that caught the edge of Agatha's favourite mahogany side table. The wood splintered, and the bottle shattered, sending a spray of expensive bubbles and shards of glass across the Persian rug. "My rug!" Agatha shrieked, her instinct for property preservation momentarily eclipsing her fear for her life. "That was an antique. You've ruined everything," Margaret screamed, her voice no longer the refined trill of a village hostess, but a jagged, raw sound. She held the broken neck of the bottle like a jagged dagger. "I worked for 20 years to make this village respect me. 20 years of baking and committees and putting up with that lecherous fool of a husband." Mrs. Witherspoon had retreated behind the sofa, her hands over her mouth, while Mrs. Bloxby stood her ground, though her face was pale. James moved forward, his arms outstretched in a calming gesture. "Drop the bottle, Margaret," James said firmly. "It's over. Bill is right outside." "No." Margaret backed away toward the French doors that led to Agatha's garden. Her eyes darted around the room, the calculated malice of the morning replaced by the frantic energy of a cornered animal. Brenda deserved it. She sat there in her church pew, judging me, talking about moral rot. She knew Arthur was emptying our savings to keep that woman in Evesham. She was going to stand up at the bake-off and announce that the Bloomsburys were bankrupt and broken. I couldn't let her. I couldn't. Agatha felt a strange, cold pang of pity. She knew what it was like to build a life on the fragile foundation of appearances. She knew the terror of the mask slipping. But then she looked at the shattered glass and remembered the body of Brenda Harrison. "So, you poisoned the water," Agatha said, her voice steadying. "You knew Sanford had brought the carafes. You knew everyone would think he was the culprit if something went wrong, a developer's revenge on a stubborn old woman. He was so easy to manipulate," Margaret spat, her lip curling. "He wanted Brenda gone as much as I did. I told him I'd help him soften her up with a bit of sedative in the water. He didn't know it was concentrated almond oil. He was too greedy to ask questions. And then, when he realized what had happened, when he saw the police at the hall, he panicked. He called me. He was going to confess everything just to save his own skin." "So you went to the manor," James prompted. "I went to comfort him," Margaret said with a chilling giggle. "I brought him a drink. He was so distraught he didn't even notice the smell. A little push, a little staging. It was so simple. Until you started poking around, Agatha. You and your London arrogance." She lunged suddenly, not at James, but at Agatha. The jagged glass swept through the air. Agatha, fueled by a lifetime of dodging aggressive paparazzi and difficult clients, ducked with surprising agility. She grabbed a heavy decorative tray from the coffee table and used it as a shield. The glass scraped against the silver-plated surface with a horrific screech. "Bill," Agatha bellowed. "Get in here." The French doors burst open, but it wasn't Bill Wong. It was the curate, Mr. Arbuthnot, looking utterly terrified and holding a garden rake. "Stop, in the name of Theo, dear heavens." The distraction was enough. James leaped forward, grabbing Margaret's wrist and twisting it until the broken bottle fell to the floor. Margaret collapsed, her strength vanishing as quickly as it had arrived. She sank into a heap on the floor, sobbing into her navy blue sleeves. Only then did Detective Sergeant Bill Wong and a uniformed constable sprint through the front door. "Sorry, Agatha," Bill panted, looking at the chaos. "The back gate was locked. We had to climb over." "I expect a full reimbursement for the rug, Bill," Agatha said, though her knees were finally starting to shake. She reached for the nearest glass of champagne that hadn't been smashed and downed it in one go. Wilkes appeared in the doorway a moment later, taking in the scene with a look of profound disappointment that he hadn't been the one to make the arrest. "Mrs. Raisin," he said, his voice flat, "it appears you've been busy." "I've been doing your jog, Inspector," Agatha snapped, her bravado returning now that the handcuffs were being clicked onto Margaret's wrists. "While you were busy arresting innocent boys in ponds, I was uncovering a double homicide and a financial embezzlement scheme." Margaret was led away, her head bowed, her beige cardigan-which shed changed back into for the tea-looking limp and defeated. The village matrons followed, Mrs. Witherspoon whispering a mile a minute into her phone, likely alerting the Cotswold Times before the police car had even left the drive. Mrs. Bloxby paused at the door, placing a gentle hand on Agatha's arm. "You did a brave thing today, Agatha, though perhaps a little theatrical." "Theatricality gets results, Mrs. Bloxby," Agatha said, leaning against the doorframe. "Once the house was empty of everyone but James, The silence felt heavy. James looked at the splintered table and the spilled wine. "You really did buy the champagne from Harrods, didn't you?" he asked, a small smile playing on his lips. "Of course," Agatha said, lifting her chin. "If one is going to be murdered, one should at least have a decent vintage on hand for the wake." James laughed, a warm, genuine sound that made Agatha's heart do a little somersault. "Come on, let's get you out of here. I think you've had enough of your own cottage for one day. Dinner at the Red Lion? My treat." Agatha felt a glow of triumph that had nothing to do with solving the crime. The Red Lion? It's a bit common, isn't it? I hear there's a new French place in Evesham. "Evesham might be a bit soon for you, Agatha," James teased. "Let's stick to the village. We can listen to everyone talk about how you're the hero of the hour." Agatha smiled. It wasn't the London face smile. It was the smile of a woman who knew that, for tonight at least, she finally belonged. Chapter 10. The bittersweet taste of victory the following Tuesday. Carsely was bathed in a golden, deceptive autumn light that made the village look like a postcard from a more innocent century. One would never have guessed that, only 72 hours prior, the local hall had been a theatre of death, and the village's social queen had been carted off in a police van. Agatha Raisin sat in her garden, wearing a pair of oversized sunglasses and a silk dressing gown that screamed recovering heroine. She was nursing a cup of coffee and reading the Cotswold Times. The headline was everything she could have hoped for. Village Bake-Off murder. Local resident Agatha Raisin assists police in dramatic arrest. "Assists?" Agatha muttered to Boswell. "I practically performed the citizen's arrest while Wilkes was probably at home polishing his boots." Still, the tone of the village had shifted. When Shed walked to the post office earlier that morning, she hadn't been met with cold shoulders or turned backs. Instead, there were whispers not of the cheat, but of the detective. Mrs. Witherspoon had actually waved. It was a victory, but like most of Agatha's triumphs, it felt strangely hollow in the morning light. A shadow fell across her newspaper. She looked up to see James Lacey leaning over the stone wall, looking remarkably refreshed. "Reading your press clippings, Agatha?" he asked, a teasing glint in his eyes. "I am monitoring the narrative, James. Public relations is a 24-hour job." She folded the paper with a sharp snap. "And I see they barely mentioned your role. I'm so sorry." "I'm quite happy to remain a footnote," James said, vaulting over the wall with his usual annoying grace. "I'm more interested in the aftermath. I hear Arthur Bloomsbury has fled to Evesham permanently. The house is going on the market." Agatha sighed, her pride momentarily eclipsed by a flicker of genuine sadness. Poor Margaret. Not that I excuse the poisoning, of course it was terribly bad form, but to be driven to such lengths by a man like Arthur and a tongue like Brenda's. "It's a waste. It's the Cotswolds, Agatha," James said, sitting on the edge of her stone bench. "Beneath the roses and the limestone there's always a bit of rot. People here value their secrets more than their lives. Well, I've saved the village from a housing development, a murderer, and a very bad lemon drizzle," Agatha said, standing up and smoothing her gown. "I expect a statue in the square by Christmas." "I think Ya'll have to settle for an invitation to the vicar's sherry party," James laughed. "Which, by the way, is tonight. Were you coming?" Agatha felt the familiar flutter of romantic hope. "Is that an invitation to escort me, James? Or are you just checking the attendance list?" James hesitated, that impenetrable wall of British reserve sliding back into place. "I'll see you there, Agatha. I have some research to finish first." He disappeared back over the wall before she could press him. Agatha stood alone in her garden, the silence of the village settling around her like a heavy blanket. The excitement was over. The adrenaline had evaporated, leaving her with the realization that her kitchen table was still broken, her rug was ruined, and she was still, at the end of the day, a middle-aged woman in a small village with only 2 cats for company. She went inside and looked at her kitchen counter. She had bought a bag of flour, a real one, and a jar of jam. Oh! She had intended to actually learn how to bake a Victoria Spangito, prove to herself that she could do it without Harrods. She looked at the flour. She looked at the oven. Then she looked at the phone. "Don't be ridiculous," she told the cats. "I've just solved a double murder. I deserve a rest." She picked up the phone and dialed the number for a high-end catering service in Cheltenham. "Yes, hello? I'd like to order a dozen artisan scones and a selection of petit fours for delivery this afternoon." "No, don't put them in a box. Can you put them on a ceramic plate that looks slightly chipped? I want them to look homemade." She hung up, a small, satisfied smile returning to her face. Agatha Raisin might have a conscience, and she might even have a heart, but she would never, ever lose her instincts for a good cover-up. As she waited for her delivery, she caught sight of her reflection in the hallway mirror. Her London face was back sharp, determined, and ready for the next social hurdle. She had survived the bake-off, she had outwitted the police, and she had secured her place in Carsely for at least another season. The village was quiet, the secrets were buried, and Agatha Raisin was, for the moment, the most important woman in the parish. It wasn't love, and it wasn't London, but as she listened to the church bells chime in the distance, she decided it would have to do, until the next murder, at least.